I was an early adopter of Apple products and remember feeling an instant connection to my iMac G3 in the late 90s. It was so much cooler than the beige Apple IIe that proudly sat in the dining area of my childhood home, where I learned to type with rapid accuracy. I've been a full-time Mac user since 2008. Back then, being a Mac user felt rebellious to me. Even in San Francisco, where I worked in the early days of the startup frenzy, it was uncommon, at least as an IT person, to see mature organizations fully embrace the Mac lifestyle. Here's the way I saw it. If you had a Mac in the early to mid 2000s, it meant you were tech savvy and bold. I say that because in my experience, Macs were really only in circulation early on for executives, creatives, and employees who accepted they'd likely have to support their own computer. From my perspective, the growing demand for Macs in the workplace skyrocketed around the launch of the first generation iPhone in 2007. This was a complex pivot for many organizations who'd invested heavily in Microsoft products and licensing, most of whom were also still running on-premise BlackBerry servers and could only offer support on the Windows platform from an existing in-house skill set standpoint. In my mind, this is when a lot of companies drew a firm, metaphorical line in the proverbial sand. On one side, there was the well-established Microsoft footprint firmly embedded in companies with a longer operating history, and on the other side were newer firms hip to the Mac scene, embracing hosted solutions over on-premise solutions for file storage and email, which is now just referred to as the cloud. The web interface version of traditional applications introduced a workaround for the limited availability of enterprise software that had to be installed physically on a computer. What did so many organizations find appealing about Windows? First, Windows runs on all kinds of hardware, which allowed and still allows IT organizations to develop vendor relationships with companies like Dell and IBM, or third-party resellers like CDW and SHI, who provide desktop and laptop solutions on myriad hardware configurations that fit a specific price point, as well as various offshoots such as tablets powered by Windows. Over time, I developed a Windows equals grown-up company mentality without really realizing I had abandoned my earlier connection to Mac. So from the year 2000 to 2008, my whole world was Windows. I became a Novell systems administrator and then moved into environments where Windows Active Directory was the primary mechanism for user accounts, computer management, security administration, and so on. I eventually moved into a role as a network engineer, which is what I initially went to school for, and the whole time I was all about Windows hardware and software. That all changed when the CFO at the startup I worked for decided he wanted a Mac in the year 2008. He didn't exactly ask permission to get a Mac, he just sort of had one day, and all of a sudden, the IT department had to figure this out, and they held a firm boundary by saying something like, "It's great that you got yourself a Mac. Please enjoy supporting yourself." So I volunteered to be the CFO's personal staff Mac expert and switched over from Windows cold turkey. It was a real challenge for me because I'd spent the past 8 years developing an impressive arsenal of shortcut key muscle memory and had built several workflows entirely on Windows that allowed me to manage the company's network switches, routers, and firewalls, both at the corporate sites as well as production instances hosted at data centers all across Southern California. It took a long time for me to figure out how to perform my job functions on Mac, and for certain tools, I actually had to run an instance of Windows on my Mac because, as I mentioned, a lot of enterprise tools, in my case vSphere from VMware, was simply not yet available on Mac, at least not the graphical interface version. And that is what shifted my perspective. I learned computer networking and systems administration by using a command line interface for most of the tools I worked with in the early 2000s. When I first got back into working with Mac, it felt very new to me, and there were a lot of times when I'd get frustrated because I knew how to do a particular thing on Windows that just wasn't working the same on my Mac. Like, where the heck did the backspace key go? And how could I delete words to the right of a blinking cursor? It took a lot of work for me to recognize that I was setting myself up for failure because I hadn't allowed any time for the transition to settle in. In my head, this should be so easy for me because, I'm an IT person and computers are my life. This should be so easy. But it wasn't. It was new and humbling. So I decided to take a step back and try to recall my early days of working at the command line interface. Instead of thinking, "Dear Mac, I really want you to do this thing I used to do on Windows," I began thinking more broadly about what I wanted to do on the computer in general. Things like, I want to capture thoughts and ideas. Then I allowed myself time to learn what types of word processing applications are even available on Mac, which was enlightening. After that, I moved on to learning the keyboard layout to familiarize myself with keys like Command instead of Control, and then all of a sudden, I was able to type fast again with a little practice and teaching my fingers to move in a new way.